Uh, the next speaker we have is David Koch. He'll be presenting an important and innovative program that has been implemented locally, improving community resilience through public-private partnerships, the BORP strategy. Mr. Koch founded his own firm, Structural Focus, in Los Angeles in 2001. After 20 years working in similar area in California, he's a registered structural engineer in a dozen states, has an expertise in seismic evaluation, historic preservation, retrofit design, and new structural design. Some of David's more notable projects include the Annenberg Performing Arts Center in Beverly Hills, the Google Los Angeles headquarters, the Red Bull North American headquarters, the Wilshire Boulevard Temple Restoration Los Angeles, and multiple buildings at DreamWorks, Warner Brothers, and Sony Pictures in Southern California area, and many others. In 2013, David co-founded and is the managing director of SAFEQ Institute, which SAFEQ Institute, which serves as a resource for post-disaster inspection information and provides direct consulting services to government entities and business owners. He believes that pre-planning and partnership with cities can greatly reduce business interruption after an earthquake or other disaster. That belief was a driving idea behind co-founding SAFEQ Institute. David currently serves on the board of directors. He's on the board of governors of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, EERI, and the Structural Engineers Institute, respectively. And he has served on numerous boards for the Structural Engineers Association in California and the board of numerous preservation organizations. So once again, please help me welcome David Koch.
Hi, I'm going to talk about a place a long ways away from Nepal. And a long time ago, it's actually 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake. Is my slideshow up? There we go. You can go to the next slide. There were some lessons learned after Loma Prieta that have to do with the inspections. And that is that it took 4 days after the earthquake before the mutual aid and the OES inspectors actually started arriving to help with the inspectors. The city of San Francisco was overwhelmed with the amount of buildings that needed to be inspected. It actually took 14 days for the city's inspectors and the mutual aid inspectors to get to all of the major buildings, and it took months and months to get to all the buildings. It took an average of 21 days for the owners to find a structural engineer because we were so busy. I was up there and I literally would run into the office and leaf through all my phone messages, find one that looked interesting and run back out of the office and go see that building. And it took months of follow-up decisions in action on the 360 red tag buildings that were in San Francisco. So it was a big deal and the city was quite overwhelmed. Next. So the question is, are building owners ready to be shut down for an indefinite period of time? And that's what this program is really all about, but there's some other advantages to it. First of all, just to get the facts straight, at least in California, the city inspectors' first priorities are healthcare, schools, and public buildings. They want to get to those buildings up and running first before they start going to the privately owned buildings. And there's really no guarantee of when the city inspectors will come by to inspect that building. So it might be weeks, it might be months. There's also no guarantee of how a building will perform. You know, we design buildings to a minimal level, theoretically, a minimal level that the code requires, but that really isn't necessarily going to guarantee that the building is going to perform as well. And even if it's new, if it's a new building and designed, how is it going to respond? We do our best, but there's no guarantees. There's no earthquake-proof building, as you all know. But the fact is that if a building is fine and an owner has a building and there's no inspection, there's no legal reason that he can't occupy the building. But if he's got tenants in that building, they want a level of confidence that they're in a safe building. So it's the owner's advantage to go get a green tag as soon as possible. But the city's they're not interested in that because they're running to all the heavily damaged buildings, the ones that need attention. So I'm going to run through this real fast, but if we go next slide, this typical multi-story building, 1990s it has some damage, right? And it's all visible to everyone. But the city inspector or the OES inspector really doesn't know the structure very well. They're going to tend to be on the conservative side because they're going down the block looking at all these buildings, and they're going to tend to be conservative. Next slide. So this is a graphic that I was trying to demonstrate what's going to happen. You have the earthquake, and then at some point, a week, 2 weeks, whatever, the city inspector might come by and they're going to put a yellow tag on this building which restricts its use. Then another week or two go by. As I said, it took 21 days for the average building owner to find a private structural engineer to come by and take a look at the building. So they come by and take a look. They start evaluating it to figure out what happens. And then weeks and weeks can go by before they can get a city inspector to come back and reclassify that building. So it might be a few months before the building, even though it's yellow tagged, it could take weeks and weeks and months before it can be reclassified. Next. So after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, about 1995, the city of San Francisco got together and figured out a new model. They wanted to get some help, and so they formed a public-private partnership, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. They called it the Building Occupancy Resumption Program. They're kind of regretting that BORP acronym now. So we're calling it B2B, and that's what we've ended up using. B2B for back to business. They have over 100 buildings that are in the program in the city of San Francisco, and in fact, the program is spread to nearly a dozen cities in California, most of them up in the Bay Area, and one by one, there's gaining a few down in Southern California right now. Next. The first one that we established was in the city of Glendale, and this is a quote from your new ICC board member, newly elected. And he's convinced that a pre-established private-public partnership is the most effective path to rapid recovery of individual business instructions. Next. So here's the P3. You've got the City Department of Building and Safety on the left. You've got the building owner and his consultant, the structural engineer, on the right. And they're getting together to form this back to business program as a partnership. And the thing to remember here is the cost of that program is borne by the building owner, because there's an advantage to the building owner to get back in his building. There's no cost to the city, or if there's minimal cost to the city, it can all be collected in fees back from the building owner. And we've been very successful in convincing the building owner that there's value in that. Next. So this is how we picture the level of program for a building owner when they're looking at what they can do. At the bottom is kind of the common practice for a relatively sophisticated building owner, where they will have an agreement with a structural engineer, or they've worked with a structural engineer over the years, and they know that that engineer, after an earthquake, is going to show up and help them get through the mess that they are in. You could go up another level and have an initial plan for kind of prioritizing it. So it's kind of sitting around the table, figure out, okay, what's critical, what isn't critical. There may or may not be a formal agreement in place. You could go up to level 3 and actually pay an annual retainer. And that is a commitment, a written contractual commitment that the engineer is going to get in the car or get on their bike or do whatever they got to do to get to those buildings after an earthquake. And then level 4 is to take that same agreement and form the public-private partnership with the city so that they can actually inspect the buildings. So I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. Next. The plan, and I'm going to run through this. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about this, but clearly the idea is the building owner hires a structural engineer. This works especially well for multi-building owners. They go through and they do an evaluation of all the buildings and they prioritize them. If they have several buildings, they figure out which ones are most important to their operations or which ones they're most worried about. It might be the ones that are most susceptible, and put together this documentation of their evaluation. Next. So part of that documentation is to create a file or a dossier about that building. And the engineer, by doing that evaluation, becomes very, very familiar with that building. They know where the weak spots are. They know what they need to look for So in the event of earthquake shaking, they can go right to the spot and make a very knowledgeable assessment of the damage to that building. Next. Not going to read through all of these, but you can include training for the building owners' personnel. You will develop all these triage procedures, and eventually you put together documentation to submit it to the city. So there's an application that the city has to go through and approve. Next. The key here is that each building is assigned a specific pre-trained and pre-qualified designated inspector and backups. It's not just one. You want to have a couple of backups. They will be automatically deputized in the event of a declared emergency. So the way we've put this thing together is there's this OES training in California, Office of Emergency Services, called SAP. And that's formal training to learn the ATC 20 procedures, post-earthquake inspections of buildings, developed by ATC. And everybody that is going to be one of these pre-approved inspectors has to have that SAP training. Then there's other stuff. There's emergency provisions for shoring and repairs, and there's all these protocols that have to be worked out for communications with the city. Next. So this designated engineer, or it can be an architect, as long as you have the SAP training, is committed to respond right away. We have contracts with some of our clients that we have to be at the site within 8 hours of daylight after an earthquake. So if it happens at 2 in the morning and sun rises, at 7, we better be there by whatever that would be, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The good news is that these inspections are going to be much more effective than if left to the city. And I hope I'm not offending anybody out there. But the key is that this professional has already studied the building. He knows where the vulnerabilities are, the critical functions. They will tend to not be as conservative because they're willing to take into account what they already know about the building. They can also help train the owner's staff to be more effective. So if it happens in the middle of the night, the only people that are there at the building might be security guards. So if we can train the security guards so that they know what to look for, and then when the engineer shows up on site, they can say, hey, there's some cracks in stairwell number 3 or whatever, you can be much, much more efficient. There's also a key that this designated inspector will not leave the building. Once they get there, that's their building. They don't have a list of 100 more buildings that they have to inspect and go down the street. They're going to stay there and take action to get that building back up and running. There also will be there if there are aftershocks. Because think about it, if you have a city inspector come by and then the next day there's an aftershock, what do? You have to go back and check it out again. When are they going to get back there to inspect that building? Next. I'm not going to go into this. There's some California code sections that protect the engineer and the cities so that the liability falls in with the city regarding this matter. I don't want to go into this in detail, but we can go to the next slide. So the key is that these inspectors are subject to the same legal provisions as the city and the SAP inspectors, the mutual aid inspectors. There are, the good news is that these inspections, like I said, should be of higher quality than the city inspectors should be able to provide. They are trained in ATC and they're licensed professionals, so that above all else, they do have a license that they have to fall back on. And the results should be a higher quality inspection. Next. There's a long application that has to be filled out that the city has to approve, and it's got the resumes, it's got the information about the building, because the chief building official has to be comfortable that this inspector is doing what they need on his behalf. So I'm not going to read through all these, but there's all these very specific requirements. Next. The Back to Business program reduces danger, and it does so because if you realize if there's any delays in inspection, there's a chance that people are going to try to get back into that building, even if it's a dangerous building. I went through that with Loma Prieta. People were begging to be left back in their building so they could go get their stuff, go get their contents. And, we had the police out there blocking people from getting back in. So the longer it goes without inspection, the bigger the problem you're going to have. There's also, it relieves the uncertainties associated with inspectors that are unfamiliar with the buildings. They could be not overly aggressive, they could be in the other direction too. They might get it wrong, and it's not going to be a high-quality inspection. It also minimizes the time period after an earthquake and before the inspection. Next. Oops, go back one. A key here is, and our clients have done this, that some of these building assessments, when we're preparing the program, you might uncover a few deficiencies in the buildings. And by the time the owner's been through all this, they're usually thinking pretty proactively, and we end up doing some proactive retrofitting. So we catch some stuff that might not have been caught before. They're more familiar with the buildings, so they're going to understand the damage, and there's some damage training for your staff, as well as the response is faster, and actions can be taken faster to mitigate further damage. Next. This is a quote from Lucy. You've already heard from Lucy tonight. I'm sorry she missed this. But back at the Buildings at Risk conference in 2013, she came up with this quote and basically said that the cost of an earthquake is 50% due to business interruption. I know she has some other statistics, but that was a quote that struck me a couple of years ago when I heard that. Next. So what that tells you is that the time the building is out of operation is huge. We've already talked about safety. Now we're talking about business interruption. So here's a graph, the graphic, which is kind of a continuation of what I showed you earlier. The one on top is for the building, that same building, the yellow tag building with no agreement in place. The one in the middle is if you have what I call the level 3 program without an agreement with the city. It's just they have a really good ironclad contract with the engineer, and then the one at the bottom is when you have that agreement in place at the city. So you can see it can be a drastic reduction in the time the building is out of operation. Next. So in summary, a B2B program supports our community's resilience. It ensures our citizens' safety. It keeps the city's clients, if you want to consider major building owners clients. It reduces the number of buildings that the city is responsible for inspecting. If you have 1,000 buildings in your city and you get 50 of them, 50 of the major buildings in the program, that's 50 less that the city has to worry about. So they can concentrate more on the residential properties and the other properties that are less complicated generally. It reduces business interruption costs for the building owners. It maintains a strong tax base for the city, because if the city doesn't shut down, they've still got the operations, they can still pay their taxes. And then on top of all that, the city does have an obligation to help get the buildings back open safely as soon as possible. Next. It may result in some proactive retrofitting, which I'm sure the city would be very happy for building owners to do. It increases the city's resilience and should reduce the overall recovery time for the community, not just for individual buildings. And as some of the people that we've been working with have noted a lot, that it increases the citizens' confidence in city government. So, just real quick, the future, what we are looking at is that, first of all, this program could be applied to other regional disasters where a city building department may be overwhelmed. So if you think about hurricanes, for example, or floods, for example, this kind of program can be put in place, but it is this partnership. That's the key to it. It's what I would like to do is get the B2B processes in future ATC 20. The next time that is updated, I think there's some things that we could include in that and get them in the formal procedures. We have a problem at first when we started thinking about this. We were thinking, okay, you can decrease insurance premiums. Well, there's some people out there called actuaries that until they see it, they're never going to move. And so if we could get some data to convince the actuaries that this makes sense and we're actually lowering the risk of the building owners, then maybe we can get some breaks in the insurance premiums. Of course, there's technology that can be incorporated, and I'm very interested in looking at emergency repairs and emergency shoring and how we can get that into the codes to allow in these emergency situations to get these buildings repaired by their private inspector who's been deputized, so you can take action to get the building back up and running as soon as possible, and maybe then go for a post event kind of approval of some sort with the city. So I'd like to look into that. Next. Just some closing statements about confidence. Owners know that they've reduced their risk. Clients know that the facility will be up and running sooner to service them. Tenants feel safer and are confident because of their reduced business risks. Employees feel safer and confident their jobs will be secure because they're going to be out of a job if they can't go to the office. And again, it increases citizens' confidence in city government. Next. This is a quote from Lawrence Cornfield, who was kind of the brainchild behind this thing back in San Francisco. He's the chief building inspector, and he's the one that kept talking about citizens' confidence in the government. Next. That's it. There's some resources there. There's safeeqinstitute.com. There's sanfranciscodbi.org. And the last one is a Structural Engineers Association of Northern California has got some really good resources regarding a building occupancy resumption program. So please go there and take a look. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for bringing the public-private sector perspective. Earlier yesterday, we shared briefly at our Global Membership Council ICC's global services experience as we go through a Southeast Asian nation in the public-private enterprise and how those issues can be brought forward to address the nation's needs. Thank you again for your time and your presentation.